Among Marx's most misunderstood theories, there is one that serves as the poster boy of the decades of strawman attacks and misrepresentations from all facets of the right, Marx's understanding of the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value has been criticized with meaningless attacks such as the mud pie argument and even more sophisticated misinterpretations with the transformation problem for decades now. Some criticisms even go as far as to say the theory is ad hoc. It's easy to understand why there's so much commotion about the LTV. Marx's labor theory of value is one of, if not the most important scientific theories he has ever hypothesized, and is significant in all 3 volumes of Capital. For this reason, one who does not understand the LTV simply does not understand basic substantiation that Marx used to predict capitalist crises. However daunting reading Capital may seem from one's massive historical narrative to Volume 2's plethora of mathematics and formulas, the labor theory of value is not the most difficult theory to grasp in the world. It does require, however, a basic grasp of Marxist economics that is often missing from critiques, and thus I will outline the labor theory of value in these series of videos to give the most clear and concise explanation as possible. Do keep in mind by doing this, I will be quoting Capital, but there is no substitute for reading Capital for yourself or any of the other supplementary texts that I cite. The labor theory of value, first and foremost, is a scientific model that attempts to explain macro trends in a capitalist economy by hypothesizing the continuous cycle of capitalism. It is not, as many goofishly mistake, debunked by supply and demand, of which we'll speak later, and it is not something that Marx was advocating towards as some kind of attainable goal. Instead, think of the LTV as a microscope into a capitalist economy, which is ultimately a cycle of contradiction, leading to instability for the macroeconomy. Ironically enough, supply and demand theory is often cited to contest the labor theory of value. But supply and demand is not the utterance of God that many claim. Supply and demand not only depends on a plethora of assumptions that render it virtually useless in the real world, but it also inherently contradicts itself. I will explain more about this in part 2. The next important issue to discuss is the Austrian rejection of the word exploitation. Do keep in mind that when Marx says exploitation within the theory, it is used entirely scientifically and not morally. For rebuttals against this, I will primarily be citing Paul Cockshott, Allen, and Bukharin. Feel free to post any responses or rebuttals to these arguments down below. Although the LTV is a scientific theory, there are portions of Capital in which Marx does present a moral argument against exploitation. However, this is completely irrelevant to the coherency and legitimacy of the theory itself. One could make the same argument for the LTV while being entirely pro-capitalist. So any reference to this theory being debunked due to Marx's own personal morals is irrelevant. If I discover cells, I may think that it's immoral that a cell has a nucleus and a ribosome, but that doesn't ultimately falsify my discovery of cells. Whether one agrees or disagrees with Marx's morals is completely irrelevant to the actual LTV. You might be asking, how does the LTV act as a microscope? Well, very briefly, the labor theory of value allows us an insight into which sector of an economy we should be investigating for long-term secular trends in capitalism. For example, should we begin our investigation into the productive or service sector? I'll explain what those are later. Well, because of the LTV's framework, which I'll explain later, we know that our investigation should begin with the productive sector. Now, that is not to say that there is no possible secondary hypothesis that can better explain secular long-term trends in capitalism and capitalism's underlying functions. However, until such hypothesis is formulated, the labor theory of value will remain the best possible hypothesis for its explanatory window. Now, with that all the way, we should underline some basic concepts in Capital so you can understand it at further points. In order to understand value in the labor theory of value, we must first understand what a price actually is. Price is, first and foremost, a social relation. Prices are not tangible, and no items are branded with prices. Because there is no inherent price of an item taken singly, the item is thus priceless. In order to arrive at a price, several conditions must be met. First, an item, which at the moment of exchange is now considered a commodity, must be exchanged against another commodity. Why? Well, for obvious reasons. You cannot define a single price for trading what would either be nothing or an exponential amount of things. Thus, we must obviously have another vendable physical commodity for us to exchange. We'll discuss services later. Secondly, there must be a set quantity of each of the items being exchanged. as an infinite amount of each item would make the exchange unquantifiable and thus it would be possible to reach a single price. You can't trade a loaf of bread for infinity. So now that we've gotten our two commodities, let's say 20 yards of linen and a coat, let's also presuppose that these 20 yards of linen and coat are now meeting at the social point of exchange and thus take the commodity form. Let's also presuppose that in this world 1 yard of linen is equitable to 1 coat, and thus the exchange is made. One producer exchanges his 20 yards of linen for the other producer's 1 coat. Karl Marx in Volume 1 states that exchange value is a, quote, quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort. Essentially, what he means by values in use are use values. So the coat has the use value of keeping you warm, and the linen has the use value of being able to be threaded into something that you want. And so you are trading the equitable quantities of each commodity against each other, and therefore it's an equal exchange. Now we'll discuss what the least common denominator between these two objects is in a bit, but that's all you basically have to know, is that one use value is being traded for another use value. Exchange value is a social relation that manifests at the moment of exchange between two commodities. Quantities of each specific commodity will exchange at their equivalents. We'll overlook abstract labor for now. Now you might be wondering what money has to do with all this. Money is, simply put, a universal commodity that is much easier to haul around than, let's say, a chair for instance. Not all universal commodities are money, but all money is a universal commodity. In capitalism, money will eventually arise from silver and gold to paper money, and all commodities in capitalist exchange will be measured in the sole commodity of money. By using money, however, we are no longer truly exchanging for equivalents. Instead, we are fed fairy tales all of our lives that money leads to equivalent exchange, when in reality, the actual least common denominator between the commodities for equal exchange is the socially necessary labor time. Oh, okay, I'll slow down with all these words for now, but I'll just refer to this common denominator for now simply as labor. Okay, now that we've covered exchange value, we can cover some micro theory and the understanding of the LTV. I'm sure at least some big-brained Thomas Sowell clone has posted one of these graphs before and danced about as if they single-handedly defeated a series of books and manuscripts well over 2,000 pages long. Believe it or not, supply and demand plays an interesting role in economics. You see, supply and demand is a model of pricing that begins from various laughably absurd assumptions, almost to the point of fantasy. While supply and demand begins from the assumption of a completely free market and attempts to include externalities and taxes, its foundational logic is fundamentally unrealistic. It also makes several other assumptions, such as the rationality of its consumers being finite, the assumption that their income is known, and the assumption that consumers and sellers are price takers, to name a few. All of that is outside the scope of this video. You see, supply and demand does a poor job of explaining why a good has an underlying price and what makes for equivalent exchange. For example, taking a completely free market, the most obvious laws of supply and demand are high supply equals low demand and low demand equals high supply. However, what is the law for the origin of prices when supply and demand are held at equilibrium, observable by plotting a supply and demand chart here? Well, the answer lies within the equilibrium price itself. For supply and demand to be logically coherent, there must be a fluctuation between supply and demand at equilibrium. For example, when asked why diamonds are so expensive compared to burgers, one would claim it is because the supply of diamonds is so low and thus the demand is so high, whereas the supply of burgers is so high that the demand is so low. Burgers thus have a lesser price and diamonds have a greater price. Now logically this makes sense until you fundamentally examine the logic behind supply and demand theory in total. Let's now take the supply and demand of diamonds and burgers to be the same. That's kind of odd. Why is it that all of the diamonds are still considerably more expensive than the burgers? Keep in mind that both of them are held at equilibrium, meaning that appealing to supply and demand fluctuations wouldn't actually work for this example. This question is at the heart of what the labor theory of value attempts to explain. You see, to Marx, the existence of the equilibrium price ultimately contradicted supply and demand's ability to determine natural prices. You see, to Marx, the existence of supply and demand is ultimately a fantasy. From Volume 2 of Capital, the volume of the mass of commodities brought into creation by capitalist production is determined by the scale of this, and here Marx is referring to this as the amount of surplus value one capitalist can get out of production in an industry, production, and its need need for constant expansion, and not by a predestined ambit of supply and demand needs to be satisfied. Marx's fierce attack on supply and demand here really comes from the illusion that capitalists see demand and attempt to supply it. In reality, this is false. We can see in the real world an extreme need for food and water in key poor nations in capitalist Africa. If the capitalist was really concerned with needs, why aren't there McDonald's on every street corner in Ghana? Really, the capitalist produces where he can exploit most, and therefore gets the most surplus value. Marx also noted that goods can only be exchanged for their market prices, meaning fluctuations in their equilibrium price, but not the equilibrium price itself. Nothing is easier to understand than the disproportion between supply and demand and the consequent divergences of market prices from their market value. If demand and supply coincide, they cease to have any effect, and it is for this very reason that commodities are sold at their market value. If demand and supply cancel each other out, they cease to explain anything, have no effect on market value. Great. Now that we understand supply and demand and why Marx rejects it, let's look at Part 3. Socially Necessary Labor Time. Capital is an amazing series of books and easily my favorite books of all time. The reason I have taken the time to give this brief synopsis of the series of Capital is to demonstrate that Marx operates with, essentially, Lego pieces, building off another piece until the whole is created. Thus we must start with the most essential Lego piece for capitalist production: labor. The logic is simple. A is required for B and B is required for C. In capitalism, labor is required for surplus value, and surplus value is required for capitalism. If we lived in an entirely automated economy, value would be zero, and thus surplus value would be zero, and thus no capitalism. From Marx in Volume 2, capitalist production can exist and continue only to exist as long as a capital value is valorized, i.e. describes a circuit as value that has become independent. Marx uses the word valorized to basically mean creating more value for itself. Capitalism, to Marx, is a constant cycle of motion. The only way that this cycle is able to exist is for surplus value to be constantly created. Production of surplus value is the absolute law of capitalism, Marx points out. Surplus value, simply put by Marx in his work Theories of Surplus Value, is, quote, the excess of labor which the worker gives back to the capitalist over and above the quantity of labor that he receives in his wage. It's essentially the difference between what the laborer gives in terms of unpaid work and what he receives in terms of paid work in the form of a wage. And the worker is also necessary, obviously. From Volume 2 again, the constant existence of the working class, however, is necessary for the capitalist class, and so, therefore, is the consumption of the worker mediated by money into capital. Now that we've established that surplus value and labor are the pillars of capitalism, and without them, capitalism would collapse, let's discuss what it means for something to be socially necessary. Now keep in mind that Marx was not the first to understand that labor time is the real common denominator between two commodities exchanging. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith writes that the value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use it or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which enables him to produce it, or command it. Labor, therefore, is the real answer to the measure of the exchangeable. The theory eventually had contributions and critiques from Ricardo, and even further critiques and additions from Marx. When capitalist firms are in competition, they are competing for as much surplus value as possible. Socially necessary labor time is actually pretty easy to understand. To explain briefly, imagine an industry. Let's assume for the sake of simplicity that there are two producers in this industry, A and B. Let's say that in the year 2020, it takes firm A and firm B 5 hours to produce item X. Now let's fast forward 5 years later. Firm A has a new technology that will allow them to produce item X in only 4 hours instead of 5. Firm B, however, does not have such an item. What will happen? Well, either Firm B will invest in technology and achieve the same technology as Firm A, or Firm B will go out of business. Thus, we see that in 2020, the socially necessary labor time for this industry is 5 hours. Fast forward later to 2025, and it is now 4 hours. Keep in mind that in that example, if we were back at 2020 and there was Firm A and Firm B producing at, let's say, 5 hours for item X, and then there was Firm C producing at, let's say, 500,000 hours for item X, that wouldn't make Firm C infinitely more rich. It would actually put Firm C out of business because these are all competing firms. Another thing to keep in mind is that Marx believes that the labor theory of value is only applicable to capitalism. Although previously societies have measured equitable exchange in labor time, the true form of the least common denominator of commodity exchange. Whew. Keep in mind that the SNTLs also are fluid and time specific for any society. Now we have to go even deeper. In section 2 of chapter 1, volume 1, Marx writes that, quote, "The value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general." He goes on, "It is the expenditure of simple labor power, i.e. of the labor power which, on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account for every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor." So here we can see that Marx clearly defines the labor theory of value is the average quantity measured in hours, weeks, etc. of socially necessary, unskilled labor time that it takes to reproduce a freely reproducible good in a given time and place. Simple enough. This video, as massive as it is really outlining what the labor theory of value actually is. As I mentioned earlier, this scientific model is used to hypothesize macro trends in a capitalist economy. If you want to hear rebuttals for other theories like subjective value or marginal utility, just let me know in the comments, and I'll probably end up making it. For now, enjoy this video and stay safe. Peace.